Okay, so this is the exposure triangle, and it's one of the most important elements in photography. However, if you're a beginner photographer and just starting out, you may be a little bit confused on how the exposure triangle actually works in its rawest form. If so, then this is the perfect video for you, as I'm going to break it all down so that you can easily start exposing your photos and getting the desired results that you are after. Let's get into this. So, the exposure triangle. What is it and how does it work? Well, it's basically the relationship between shutter speed, aperture and ISO. These three main characteristics make up your exposure. They all work together to control how light or dark your image will be. First off, let's talk a little bit about what each of these aspects actually do. Let's start off with aperture. Now, aperture controls the amount of light passing through your lens. By setting the f-stop to f2.8, which on most lenses will mean that the aperture is wide open and will let the most amount of light possible through your lens. On the other hand, by setting the f-stop to f16 will make the size of your aperture very small, dramatically reducing the amount of light able to pass through. This is not all though, because aperture also has a creative aspect to it as well, being depth of field. And I feel this is what most people are familiar with when they talk about aperture. How this essentially works is when you increase your f-stop to f16 wide open will give you a very shallow depth of field, giving you that blurry background that we all know and love. The same happens when we go the opposite way and shrink the aperture to something like f16. This time, however, it will give us a deeper depth of field, allowing us to have a lot more of our scene in focus. And now this may all seem backwards. Surely a smaller f-stop like f2.8 means a smaller aperture, right? No, and the way to remember how this actually works is this. The smaller the f-stop, f2.8, the bigger the aperture and the more light passing through the lens. It also gives us a shallower depth of field. On the other hand, a bigger f-stop like f16 equals a smaller aperture and letting less light pass through the lens, thus giving us a deeper depth of field. Aperture at the beginning can be rather confusing to beginner photographers, but this is a great way to remember how it works. Next up, we have shutter speed, and this is the aspect of the triangle that is all based on time. It controls how much light is exposed to the sensor by opening the shutter for a period of time. Setting your shutter to a value of 1/4 means your shutter will remain open for 1/4 of a second, thus exposing the sensor to the light for that amount of time. Increasing your shutter to, say, 1/500 means your shutter will be open for 1/500 of a second and exposing the sensor to a lot less light and making your image a lot darker. Similarly to aperture, the shutter speed also has a creative aspect to it as well. As mentioned a second ago, the shutter speed is all based around time. How much time the shutter is open for and how much time the sensor is exposed to the light. By slowing down the shutter and increasing the amount of time the shutter is open, any motion in your scene, cars driving by, running water, things like that, will be captured as motion blur. This is essentially called a long exposure and is how landscape photographers capture smooth running water when photographing things like waterfalls. The same goes for the opposite end of the scale. If we increase our shutter to something like 1/1000, the shutter will remain open for 1/1000th of a second, exposing your sensor to a lot less light, but also any motion in your scene will be frozen in time. I'm currently working on in-depth videos about shutter speed and aperture, which will be released soon, so stay tuned for those. ISO, on the other hand, controls how sensitive your camera's sensor is to that light. By setting the ISO value to something like ISO 100 will make your camera's sensor less sensitive to light, thus making your image darker. However, increasing the ISO to 1600 will not only make your camera's sensor more sensitive and the image brighter, but will also start introducing noise into the image. This is because boosting your ISO is essentially an artificial way of brightening your image, and by increasing your ISO, you're increasing the amplification of the signal and introducing more noise into the image. It's just something to be aware of. Also, if you want a more in-depth video on how ISO works, let me know in the comments down below. After understanding what shutter speed, aperture and ISO do, the next question that needs to be asked is how do we use these three aspects, these three elements of the exposure triangle to properly expose our image. The first thing we need to decide is how much of our scene we want in focus. Now this really depends on the look that we are trying to go for, as a shallower depth of field using an f-stop of f2.8 will create a lot more depth in the scene, giving you that blurry background or foreground depending on where you focus. This will also let in more light, whereas choosing a larger aperture like f16 will give you a deeper depth of field with a lot more of your scene in focus, but will also make your image a lot darker. After choosing your aperture, this will then determine the rest of your settings. What do I mean by that? Well, if you decide to choose an aperture of say f2.8 to get that super smooth blurry background and accentuate that depth, this will also let in a lot of light, as f2.8 is a wide open aperture. This means that we are going to want to use a faster shutter speed, say something like 1/800 of a second. This is to reduce the amount of light that will come in contact with our sensor and will balance out our exposure and prevent our image from being overexposed. Now, if you have a lot of light available to you, then the ISO can essentially be set to something like ISO 100 or as low as you're comfortable with. This will be our exposure. But say, for example, we want to capture a scene with a deeper depth of field using an aperture of f16, which right off the bat inevitably leaves us needing more light. The natural answer to this would be to lower our shutter speed to let in more light. But as we discussed earlier, slowing down our shutter would then introduce motion blur, depending on how far we push this. Now this may be exactly what you're looking for if you're wanting to capture a long exposure. However, what if you want to freeze any motion that you have in your image? For example, if there are birds in the sky and you want to freeze them in time. If so, you will now need to increase your shutter to a point that will get you the desired results that you are after. What this will most likely do is make your image even darker, leaving us with only one other option, which is our ISO. Now, as discussed earlier, the ISO is a way of artificially increasing the brightness of our image by increasing the sensitivity of our camera's sensor. By selecting a high ISO value like ISO 1000, this will indeed brighten up our image and balance out our exposure, but increasing your ISO to ISO 1000 and above will start to introduce noise into the image, which as photographers is something we always try and avoid. Getting the right exposure is all a balancing act and requires some pushing and pulling to get the image looking the way you want. If you need more light but don't want to introduce much noise into the image, at the same time you still want to freeze that motion, you may have no other choice but to lower your f-stop and widen your aperture. This can all be quite confusing at first, but I promise after practicing and putting in the work, it will seem like second nature, and you will soon do it without even thinking about it. It's honestly that easy. Now, there is a lot more I can go into in terms of how photographers actually measure light using something called stops of light or stops of exposure, which is something I can do a whole other video on in the future. If that sounds like something you would be into, let me know in the comments down below. So I hope this video has helped you understand how to use the exposure triangle to expose your photos and get the desired results that you are after. With that said, I hope you've enjoyed this video and I found it informative. If you have, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell notification to be notified when a new video does go live. And as always, I'll see you next week for the next one.